The glass struck my shoulder before I even understood what was happening. Cold red wine spilled across my pale dress, ran down my arms, and stained the carpet beneath my feet. For a few seconds, the entire room went silent. Then came the laughter. My husband stood beside his sister with an embarrassed smile, pretending the accident was harmless, while she held the empty wineglass and looked at me as if humiliating me had been the highlight of her evening. What none of them knew was that before that night ended, the family who had spent years treating me like an unwanted servant would discover that I was the missing heir to the fortune they had secretly envied all along. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that a person's worth should never be measured by money, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share the story, and subscribe to the channel Wisdom Story House. Your support helps bring more emotional stories like this to people who need a reminder that dignity can survive even the cruelest treatment. My name is Mara Ellison, and for the first 3 years of my marriage, I believed I had married into a difficult family because they simply needed time to accept me. I met my husband, Callan Royce, at a small bookstore on a rainy afternoon. He was charming, confident, and attentive in a way that made me feel safe. I had grown up without knowing much about my biological family, and I had always been told that my parents had died when I was very young. The only thing left to me was a small silver pendant with an unusual crest engraved on its back. I never imagined that tiny piece of jewelry was connected to a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Callan knew me as a quiet woman who worked hard, lived modestly, and never demanded expensive things. His family, however, never seemed satisfied with me. His mother, Lenora, constantly reminded me that I had no impressive background. His older sister, Sable, was worse. She was beautiful, wealthy-looking, and proud of her position in the family. She had a way of smiling while saying cruel things, making it difficult for anyone else to understand how deeply her words could cut. She often called me simple, ordinary, or lucky to have married Callan. At first, I tried to ignore it. I cooked family dinners, helped with their events, remembered birthdays, and quietly supported Callan whenever he was stressed. When his business struggled, I used my savings to cover household expenses without telling anyone. When his mother needed help after an operation, I stayed beside her for weeks. I thought love meant giving without keeping score. Slowly, however, I began realizing that I was the only person in the family who believed that. Callan changed after his business became successful. He stopped asking about my day. He began spending more time with Sable and his mother, discussing investments and family properties while I was expected to remain outside those conversations. Whenever I questioned him, he told me that important financial matters were not something I needed to worry about. I swallowed my hurt because I still loved the man I had married. The family party happened on a bright Saturday afternoon at the Royce estate. The house was enormous, with tall windows, white stone walls, manicured gardens, and expensive cars lined along the driveway. I wore a simple ivory dress because Callan had told me the event would be formal but relaxed. I arrived carrying a small homemade dessert, hoping it would make everyone smile. Instead, Sable looked at the dessert and laughed, asking whether I had brought something from a neighborhood bakery because I couldn't afford anything better. I forced a smile and placed it on the table. As the afternoon continued, I noticed Callan whispering with Sable near the terrace. They glanced toward me several times. Something felt wrong. Later, Callan approached me and quietly complained that I had embarrassed him by speaking to one of his investors without knowing who the man was. I apologized even though I had only thanked the investor for complimenting the garden. Sable overheard and decided to make a scene. She raised her glass and announced that everyone should celebrate the family's newest business achievement. Several guests applauded. Then she turned toward me and jokingly said that perhaps I should also receive an award for surviving 3 years among people far above my social level. The laughter that followed was painful. I looked at Callan, expecting him to defend me. He didn't. Instead, he smiled awkwardly and told everyone that Sable was only joking. That was when I finally understood something I had refused to admit for years. My husband wasn't protecting me because he didn't believe I deserved protection. A few minutes later, I walked toward the kitchen to escape the attention. Sable followed me. She complained that I was ruining the mood by looking upset. I told her I needed some air. She stepped closer, holding a glass of red wine, and told me that if I couldn't handle the Royce family, I should simply leave it. I turned away. The next moment, wine covered my dress. Sable claimed it had been an accident. Callan came running over, but instead of asking if I was okay, he looked at my stained dress and sighed as though I had caused the problem. Sable laughed and said I was being dramatic. I stood there trembling, surrounded by people who had watched me be humiliated and said nothing. Then an elderly man near the entrance suddenly froze. His name was Everett Vale, a respected attorney who had represented several major families for decades. He stared at the silver pendant around my neck. His face changed completely. He walked toward me slowly and asked where I had gotten it. I told him it had belonged to my mother. Everett's hands began to shake. He asked me my mother's name. When I answered, the color disappeared from his face. For years, I had believed my mother was simply a woman who had died young. But Everett knew her. He had been the legal advisor to my grandfather, Augustus Vale, the founder of Vale Meridian Holdings, one of the largest privately controlled investment companies in the country. Everett told everyone that my mother had disappeared after a family dispute more than 20 years earlier. Her daughter, the only direct heir to Augustus Vale's remaining private estate, had also vanished from the family's records. That daughter was me. The room became completely silent. Callan stared at me as if he had never seen me before. Sable's smile disappeared. Everett explained that my grandfather had spent years searching for me. His estate had remained under legal protection because the inheritance could not be permanently transferred until the missing heir was identified. The silver pendant I wore contained the exact family crest used in the original inheritance documents. I couldn't speak. My entire life had been built around the belief that I was ordinary, forgotten, and alone. Now everyone was telling me I had never been forgotten at all. My grandfather had searched for me until the end of his life. Everett immediately contacted the trustees, and within days, documents, photographs, and archived records began arriving. There were pictures of my mother as a young woman. There were photographs of my grandfather holding a baby who looked exactly like me. There were letters he had written over the years, each one expressing hope that someday his granddaughter would come home. I cried when I read them. Not because of the money. Because for the first time in my life, I realized someone had been waiting for me. Callan suddenly became apologetic. He claimed he had always loved me and had never cared about money. Sable also changed her attitude, insisting that the wine incident had been an accident and that she had always considered me family. But I no longer needed their approval. The woman who had stood silently while they mocked her was gone. The inheritance did not make me arrogant. It simply gave me the freedom to stop accepting disrespect. I moved out of the Royce home and began working with the Vale trustees to understand the foundation my grandfather had created. I discovered that he had wanted much of his fortune used to help families who had lost everything, provide scholarships, and support children who grew up without stable homes. That became my purpose. Months later, I returned to the same estate for one final meeting. Callan and Sable were there. They expected anger, perhaps revenge. Instead, I walked in calmly. I told them I had forgiven them, but forgiveness did not mean returning to the life they had broken. I told Callan that love without respect was not love, and family without kindness was only a name. Then I walked away. Outside, the afternoon sky was clear, and sunlight spread across the gardens. I touched the silver pendant at my neck and remembered the woman I had once been, the woman who thought she needed to earn a place at someone else's table. She never needed to. She had simply been sitting at the wrong table. From that day forward, I promised myself that my grandfather's wealth would never become a reason to look down on anyone. I would use it to lift people who felt invisible, because I knew exactly what invisibility felt like. And perhaps that was the greatest inheritance of all. Not the fortune, not the houses, not the companies. It was finally understanding my own worth. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House. Sometimes one story can remind us that being underestimated does not mean being insignificant. And before the story ends, I have one special request. Comment, I know my worth, if you believe no one should ever be humiliated because of their background, appearance, or financial situation. Mara never needed revenge. She needed the courage to walk away from people who only valued her after discovering her wealth. Her greatest victory was not becoming a billionaire heir. It was becoming strong enough to understand that she had always deserved respect, even when nobody knew her name, her family, or her fortune. Sometimes life allows people to underestimate us for a season. Sometimes they mistake our kindness for weakness and our silence for helplessness. But the day we finally recognize our own value, we stop begging for a seat at tables where we were never respected. And when Mara looked back at that afternoon when wine had stained her dress, she no longer remembered the humiliation. She remembered the moment her old life ended. Because sometimes the cruelest moment of your life is secretly the doorway to the life you were always meant to live.